Well, welcome. Thank you all for just gonna watching the participant count go up. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ron Thompson Jr. I'm policy officer here at Greater Washington, where I manage a coalition called the DC Transportation Equity Network. In my role, the DC Transportation Equity Network is a coalition of direct service, advocacy, and labor organizations working here in the district to advance mobility justice and transportation equity. We, our members of DC 10, got a preview, a different version of the presentation that you all are about to see. We were lucky enough, fortunate enough to be able to come to our friends at Transportation for America, Benito in particular, and ask for a breakdown of the what folks commonly refer to as the bipartisan infrastructure bill, or the proper title, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. And what you all will see is a broader presentation that is applicable to the Greater Washington region. We are so fortunate to have Benito and Stephen join us because they have experience here in the Greater Washington region. Benito has worked from, and if you were familiar with the Hampton Roads area, the 757 to the 410, he worked in the Hampton Roads Transit Commission and the Maryland State Highway Administration, and more recently here in the district at DDOT. Benito now works on policy at Transportation for America. Stephen comes to us by way of New Jersey, but and the University of Maryland at College Park. And he did work in Maryland at the state level and also in New Jersey and at the local level in Montgomery County and at the federal level on the Hill. With that, I turn it over to Benito and Stephen. I do need to say this before they begin. This is being recorded and it will be available on Gigi Wash's YouTube page, and slides will be made available to all the participants who were able to join us. You will hear that message again at the end of the presentation. And with that, I turn it over to Benito and Stephen.
Thank you, Ron, for the introduction. So Benito Pérez, I'm the policy director here at Transportation for America, previously with the District of Columbia Department of Transportation, Hampton Roads MPO, and Maryland State Highway, and sometime at USDOT, and joined by my colleague Stephen. And our contact information is there. Again, slides will be made available, so you'll be able to catch us later if you need to catch us by email. And so we're part of Transportation for America, is part of Smart Growth America, where we envision a country no matter where you live, who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And we do that through, our technical assistance to communities, our advocacy, especially with decision makers at state and federal level, and our thought leadership. And more specifically for Transportation for America, that's revolving around 3 guiding principles, where we focus on prioritizing maintenance, safety, and connecting people to jobs and services. So we're going to cover a couple things here. I'm not going to read every bullet point. I think everyone's hopefully can see the slides. So we got a lot to cover, and but I also want to ensure we have enough time at the end for people to dig into a couple of questions. So feel free to put clarifying questions in the chat, and we'll stop along the way if we need to. But otherwise, there will be breaks in between for actual questions. But I want to do, before I start off into the discussion here, I want to do a quick history lesson. And I'm going to go back to the 1950s. And most of our transportation system as we know it today emanates from this pivotal moment in time. World War II had just cleared, more people were getting cars, and President Eisenhower saw the Autobahn in Germany and how it's connecting the cities. And well, we want to do this in the US. So the interstate highway system was born. But some cities also took that a little too far and well, if we can connect cities, let's connect communities within the city. And that's where you got, your beltways, your, basically the stroads. So you see this a lot around the country, and it just continued to proliferate and became the standard, which then, as we now here at halfway through 2022, we're having a reckoning with our transportation system. We've seen a record increase in fatalities on our roadways. And I have to ask questions to decision makers and our planners and engineers, like, who in the world are we designing our transportation system for? Is it for vehicles or is it for people? Have we forgotten that, we have children that used to play on our streets, our seniors that were able to age in place, those with mobility challenges to be able to navigate our streets, let alone those that have been historically disenfranchised from the transportation system. Then the engineer or the planner might tell you, oh, we got this, we can do it all. I would raise a red flag very quickly and ask them and mention, like, it's impossible to prioritize safety and speed together, because there are some design choices that have to be made and compromises made to facilitate one or the other. So now digging into before we get into the infrastructure law, like, where have we been? So in the transportation funding paradigm, those who do drive, you get gasoline, you pay a gas tax, a state one and a federal one. Well, the federal one flows into what they call the Highway Trust Fund. And that then is split for every dollar, 80 cents goes to the highway side and 20 cents to the transit side. And then you're like, well, what about bikes and peds? Well, the state DOTs like to pilfer from the transit side, but really it can and should be coming also from the highway side. Then you're wondering, okay, so who's controlling the policy, the framework on our entire transportation system? So top down, what just happened last year and was enacted into law in November, Congress sets the policy and investment parameters. And that's the infrastructure law, the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act of 2021. Now the burden sits to the administration, US DOTs particularly, to implement the law. And that's why you're seeing a lot of guidance, requests for information, notice of funding opportunities. Now they're actually trying to get the dollars out the door and ensure that they're implementing, setting up the rules that are in alignment with the policy that Congress set. Then that replicates down to the state level. The state legislature will interpret what the feds did and set their own state level policies and investment parameters. And then the respective governor and state DOT will then also have to implement it in the state context, as long as it's in alignment with the federal context. Then you roll down yet another level, you have your metropolitan planning organizations. Those are your regional organizations that coordinate transportation issues and other, housing and land use, but primarily transportation. Then you go yet another level, and now you're dealing with local tribal governments, and they now are setting and implementing investment in local policies and priorities. And then that's where folks, the next level down is folks here on this call, like advocacy organizations. This is where you're advocating for specific policies and investment priorities. And then the foundation, the most important part of this entire policy lever framework is the public. They're the ones that create the community conversations, as well as vote. And by the way, just unrelated plug, early voting, Virginia and DC expires Saturday. Don't forget to vote. So, because that's who determines who your decision makers are, which then rolls right back up. So what's going on in the the public conversation in our community? Well, there's issues in safety, issues in affordability, reliability, state of good repair, climate change issues. We've seen torrential rainfalls. We've seen those videos, with the rain falling into metro or flooded roads. But another thing that they're starting to have a conversation about this, and it's being enveloped under supply chain issues, but is also our aging and beleaguered workforce. We have, bus routes that are being cut because they don't have enough drivers or operators, or, COVID is still out there. So get tested, mask up if you can, your own discretion. But you have a workforce that is being stretched thin. And then on top of that, it's aging. And, I think about my time at DDOT, where I managed a team like 20 to 30. At that time, 60, 70% were due to retire within 3 to 5 years. Well, it's not, when I had that realization, that was 3 to 5 years ago. A lot of those people have now since retired. So then there's that knowledge base that is evaporating, let alone the capacity. And if you think about it, also, we're now complicated with, electric vehicles, climate change, all these other challenges on our transportation system, like who's going to handle this? So that is a challenge for our agencies. So looking back to Capitol Hill, What are they doing? Well, usually they're pretty slow when it comes to appropriations. Fiscal year 22, they only finally got that through in mid-March. They're working on fiscal year 23. Actually, we just heard earlier this week that the House is preparing to do a markup of fiscal year 23 starting next week through the end of the month. So we should see what happens there. The president did release his budget at the end of March. And mostly is in line with what's in the infrastructure law. There's some things that were under invested in. So, that some of the advocacy will be on that front. It's like, you said you're going to spend, $100 towards transit, and you're only giving us $85. Where's the other 15 that you promised us? So there's a couple of those examples along the way. And on reconciliation, Build Back Better, there's been ups and downs. We've heard, Manchin talk about it back in May, like he's going to do something about it. At this point, now you're talking about fiscal year 23 appropriations, and then the election cycle is about to start. I'm very pessimistic of anything happening there. Infrastructure law. So that's what cleared in November, the 1.2 trillion. And as the politicians say, it was, transformational in a generation. And, but the number I want to highlight here is 650 billion. That's the surface transportation funding component of the infrastructure law. And how that breaks down is listed on the screen. When it came to the policy side of things, overall status quo. So here at Transportation for America, we were quite underwhelmed. Limited focus on maintenance, no prohibition on negative targets, but there was some improvements. They started first recognition of actually prioritizing complete streets planning at the state and regional level, some more safety investments for vulnerable road users. And on the rail side, there was a pivotal change in Amtrak's mission. Used to be like you have to return on investment. Now it's focused on customer experience and connecting communities. So just visually, like that 1.2 trillion, where all that's going to, and I mentioned that 650 billion number. Of that, 432 billion is the highway side, and I want to highlight that because that's relevant to the next slide. So of the 432, about 110 is competitive grants. The rest is what we call formula dollars. Those are dollars that are going to be guaranteed to be divvied up to the states, and everyone gets their fair share. And that fair share is divided amongst various programs. Some of them have specific focuses like on safety, on climate change, on resiliency. But then I want to highlight two pieces of the pie here: the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant. These are the highly flexible, highly generalized funding pots, usually what state DOTs use to maintain and build new roads. And the state DOT is like, well, that's all it's used for. I would raise a red flag there too. There's a lot of flexibility to fund, especially on our national highway system, transit improvements, bike ped improvements, and the surface transportation block grant is very generalized, and also, safe routes to school. So when they raise a flag, and actually one other thing, and reconnecting communities. So these funds can also be used to tear down highways and also provide the community connections around these highways. So when a state DOT tells you, oh, we can't do that's only to build and maintain our roads, I would raise a red flag or a red card if you're into soccer. So more specifically, highway funding, the infrastructure law did up more money, keeping in mind, increasing costs to do transportation, but it's a lot of status quo of those formula programs. But there's, again, a couple of new formula programs: carbon reduction, that's focused on reducing vehicle emissions. So that, there's opportunities to advance transit, advance active transportation, things like that. The Protect program focuses on climate change resiliency efforts. And then the National EV Infrastructure Program is focusing on, the states starting to lay out the foundation to electrify their transportation system. So it's not just exclusively electrifying cars. We're talking about electrifying transit, electrifying medium heavy duty vehicles. So state DOTs may be quick to think, oh, let's make sure we have, charging stations for the car. Make sure raising a flag like, what about electrifying transit, electrifying, our heavy duty vehicles. On the competitive grant side, there's a couple of exciting new opportunities, whether I've already mentioned a couple of times now, this Reconnecting Communities program. There's a $1 billion in there that looks to provide grants to communities to look at either removing divisive infrastructure, highways, or finding better ways to create seamless connections for the community around those barriers. But unfortunately, there's two programs that we're excited about that did not get funding, and in the President's 23 budget also still remain unfunded. Healthy Streets program that focuses on green infrastructure and dealing with the urban heat island effect, and the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, quite a mouthful there, that focuses on enhancing either our bike spines, so thinking like the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, and then bike networks. So think about all the bike lanes and routes that connect into the Washington Old Dominion to connect within the community.
Benito, if I could briefly piggyback in a little bit on the two unfunded programs in the FY23 budget and taking a step back to reconnecting communities and an earlier point that you made about Build Back Better and reconciliation. Could you talk, if I remember correctly, there was a legislative push to have a broader, bigger type of reconnecting communities program. And that was asked, I think, in the negotiations, during the reconciliation negotiations. I can't talk today. So I guess, could you talk briefly about the levers at which at this juncture, programs like the Healthy Streets program and Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program can be funded at this juncture post the president dropping his budget?
So reconnecting communities, let me touch that again real quick there. So Congress is not going to go exceed across the $1 billion that's in the infrastructure law. But that's not to say, if, as advocates, as I mentioned back to this slide, the formula dollars, reconnecting communities is the activities under that is eligible through these formula programs. So as state DOTs will tell you, oh, you got to apply for the competitive grant. I'm going to raise a red flag here and say, you can use the formula dollars in your state to do that as well. So for them to tell you, no, that's red flag. When it came to these programs that are unfunded right now, now is the time to speak up to members of Congress. The president provided his proposal and he didn't put money to it. But that's not to say Congress can override what the president put in, because the president's suggesting that this is what it should be. This is how I want to run the administration. But Congress is the one that will have the final say. And they did not fund it in the infrastructure law. They authorized it. They said, we create these programs, but we didn't put money in November. But that's not to say right now we can advocate and say, like, you created this program, you should put money into it. So now is the time, especially with markup happening next week. That's the beginning of the conversations on Capitol Hill. Well, technically they started, but the formal discussions start, next week. So sign-on letters, check with like the League of American Cyclists, America Walks. I'm sure, they're doing, sign-on letters to like advocate, like, hey, like we need to fund these programs. These are important for our communities. So now's the time to speak up. All right, I'm going to move on. All right. So I want to play this video real quick. Hopefully the audio cooperates with me.
And I just wrote it down.
So to this video, you had members of Congress when this law was passed saying, this is transformational, it's going to improve climate and everything. But what we found, and through our graphic here on the left, some of those key priorities, they keep creating these competitive grants, like reconnecting communities, for example, active transportation infrastructure investment. But yet, most of the money is going back to status quo, to the flexibility, which is like, let's just build more roads. So this is where we need to push back. But I want you to listen to this video real quick, because when I heard this, I was like, what?
Guidance lays out basic expectations. And I think that's where the issue is with this December 16th guidance letter. The other thing I'd like to say is, in terms of what Senator Whitehouse said and some of the comments that you have said, this is a bipartisan bill that we passed. There is a climate title in there. There is an emphasis on finding resiliency, greenhouse gas mitigation, carbon emissions, healthy streets. This is an area that we are deeply committed to. These are grant programs. These are not the formula dollars that go out. So I want to make the distinction. And would you agree, these are two separate programs or pots of money, so to speak. So
So if you just heard that, what she was saying is these are critically important things: climate, equity, complete streets, but they belong to the competitive grants. They don't belong to the formula. Yet, if you read the fine print of the law when it comes to those formula programs, those are eligible activities. But state DOTs don't like to flex those dollars for those purposes. And it doesn't help when you have members like Senator Capito saying things like that. So this is where, as advocates, we need to push on that, saying, no, that's bad. First of all, that's bad thinking and bad policy interpretation. So I wanted to play that video, but moving on the transit side, this was a fight in the infrastructure law. We had that 80-20 split I talked about earlier on. The Republicans were trying to change that and actually drop that. The Democrats luckily were able to hold 80-20, even though really our transit systems need additional funding because it's one of the few modes of transportation that doesn't have operating support. And Representative Johnson of Georgia is working very hard to create that opportunity. But we have formula funding for, to operate our systems. There's competitive grants on that front, but in the president's budget, the capital investment grant program, which is what is the money used to build new transit infrastructure, was underfunded. So hopefully we'll see Congress step in and like, we promised X dollars in infrastructure law, we are going to put down these dollars. And then of course, there a conversation with transit agencies is trying to look at flexing some dollars to do workforce development opportunities, especially when we're talking about electrification of transit vehicles, and also trying to bring in new people into the workforce. Rail side, just real quick, this was transformational. I already talked about the change in mission for Amtrak, but also the funding levels are monumental. If you talk about previous infrastructure laws, let's say FAST Act, it was 10 billion over 5 years. Now we're talking 102 billion. So it's it's monumental increase. There is a push to, again, create more opportunities, choices, and, for inner city connections. And the law looks to invest more on the rail side. And here's how it breaks down. So pausing here, because I just threw a lot out. Any questions on the high level takeaways? And as a reminder, slides will be shared. So I'll pause here for a moment and turn it over to you, Ron.
We have one question in the Q&A. This question says, one of the problems we encountered in trying to access the funds is that the cost benefit analysis necessary to be prepared for the grants was minimally changed by the US DOT economists. So while we have different objectives that didn't change the rules by which the applications are judged. How can we change this?
So I know this is something we're also looking at here, advocating with the administration. So the administration right now still has an open request for information on the infrastructure law. So Congress set forth the policy, but it doesn't get into that nitty gritty as you're highlighting your question. It's up to the administration how they interpret it. And this is an opportunity for the administration to revisit some of that methodology. So we need to vocalize those things. We need to talk to US DOTs like, hey, this is a challenge for us. And this is why it's a challenge for us. And here is our, a recommended approach to address it more equitably or more fairly to, make it more accessible for more people. I know the administration is cognizant that, sometimes it's the same folks applying for the same grants and realizing a lot of folks are being left out because the process has become so cumbersome. So they're looking at ways to standardize, data that, everyone can use at the same level and start to create a resource for technical assistance so that, communities are on equal footing to apply for these grants versus well-to-do communities just hiring, a contractor to do it for them. So they're looking at ways to level the playing field so everyone has a fair shot to get in the door to apply. But to your question about the cost benefit, I would raise the question directly to USDOT with the open RFI and say like, hey, this is a challenge. And this is why it's detrimental to the process. And if you, especially if you have a solution, bring it out there. The administration is open ears.
And Benito, if you could kind of expand on the aspect of technical assistance to those smaller DOTs, those smaller local transit authorities. Is there what at the state level, and Stephen, feel free to jump in here, what at the state level, what should state DOTs be doing to support small and local and small transit agencies that are looking to access these federal funds?
Let's see how I can try to answer this. It's all going to depend also on the state itself, but realizing some states have different, political challenges. That's why the feds are trying to jump in and create a national resource that cities can get technical assistance directly. Mm-hmm. Some states have been proactive in providing state level resource, but there are some other states that are like, we're just building roads and that's all we're doing. And yet you have communities that are like, I'll highlight an example from Texas, where San Antonio was trying to do a road diet to add bike lanes, and yet TxDOT and the governor stepped in like, you're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. So some states there's that open hostility, but and I can say right now from my reading of politics right now in Virginia, that is going to be a challenge with this current governor as well. So as much as we're gonna have to keep an eye and continue to advocate for USDOT to create those opportunities nationally so that cities and counties and small communities can actually access that technical assistance. And likewise, feel free as well as to reach out to us here at Transportation for America, either to connect you with those opportunities or for us, as members of Transportation for America to provide that technical support.
Stephen, if you
Sure. So for a state that's doing it well in terms of supporting localities on the state level, I would look at Colorado, who recently passed legislation and actually built a lot of matching funds into their state budget, as well as providing significant technical support to localities. So if you want to advocate with your state, point to Colorado, see if you can match that legislation.
And another question from the chat. Can you elaborate more on expanding efforts to make transportation more green, using solar panels, installing more EV stations?
I think we'll get into this a little more and some of the other questions in the chat a little bit in the second half. Can we move those questions? Just those who ask those questions, ask them again after the second half if we have not answered them? Yeah,
I do think yes. So these questions are a bit more specific. Happy to move on to the next session. So take it away, Steve.
Well, before just last call, any high level questions from what I've just covered before we go into like the DC, Maryland, Virginia specific context? Yeah, I see one.
Let's see. Okay. Let's see. What are the steps a small city would need to take to access funding? Maybe more specific, funding for a bike bridge over a highway, approximately $300 million. That's a very specific question. Maybe
that is a specific question. I will say, depends who you want to tangle with. Do you want to tangle with? There are some competitive grant programs that might fund that. You can also access those funds through state formula grants. So it's a matter of whether you want to apply to the federal level or access the much more substantial funds on the state level, but that's a matter of whether you have a good relationship with the state.
So depending on where you're at in the state, and let's take Metro Washington. First, you have the vision of this project, this idea, this bridge. Your first step is ensuring like your locality is on the same page there. And the follow-up, yes, you can apply for both state and federal. First, it's just this, if you're the advocate, you have this project idea. First, get your community, your city, county, on the same page. Then if you're here in the Metro Washington region, then you need to bring it up to the MPO. In this case, Metro Washington Council of Governments. If you're outside of Metro Washington, you're talking about Richmond or Hampton Roads or Baltimore area, you need to talk to the respective MPO. to get it on into their plans. No project with state or specifically federal dollars is going to get built unless it's in these designated plans called like either the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which is the 20-year vision, and then the Transportation Improvement Program. And then there's a state version of that, which is where the rubber meets the road. That's where the dollars are saying, here's the invoice, I want to build these things within the next 4 years. So for those projects, for formula, that's your first step is envision your project, get the county, city on board, get it to the MPO, get into those plans, and then you should be moving on your way from there.
Mhm. Yeah, so that was a great opportunity to zoom in to what the really rubber hitting the road of these, or the wheel hitting the track. Let's say that of these funds coming down from the federal government really to the local level looks like. So that's a great jumping off point for us here. So this is a lot of information here, so don't worry about it too much. We're going to break this down bit by bit on the next slides, but this is for your reference once you get these slides, because they will be distributed. So I'm going to go over now for Maryland, DC, and Virginia. What are these funds? We can start at Maryland. What are these funds that are coming down the pipe from the federal government, the formula funds, actually going to look like on the local level? And this is where we will determine whether these funds are Boon or boondoggle, as Greater Washington so eloquently put in the title of this webinar. So I think what I want you to look at here is the difference between, say, that top line for the National Highways Performance Program, what the state of Maryland is getting for that, $2.1 billion, versus the carbon reduction program. If you go down a bit, down a bit more, 90.7 million. That is a significant difference. And especially when states like Maryland, with generally highway-minded governors, are inclined to spend that NHPP money or the STBG money, these highly flexible formula dollars that can basically be used for anything, when you have governors that are inclined to use those mostly on highways. So next slide, just this is for DC. You can see the difference in funding. We can keep going.
I'll speak real quick for DC because we spoke with them a couple of weeks ago. Their key priorities here, because they have money to build roads, but DC is not building any new highways anytime soon. Their focus is on maintaining what they have, increasing safety on our roadways and transportation alternatives. So we'll get into more specifics, but at high level, actually it aligns pretty much with T4A's principles that I mentioned at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Keep going. And this is for Virginia. Just again, obviously Virginia, higher population, going to have more funding. These are population based. And keep going here. So now we're going to break it down each of these programs and look at what their impact is going to be when they hit these states, as they have already started to do. So again, I think if you learn anything from this presentation, this webinar, it's that most of the money, formula dollars that states get from the federal government, can be used for just about anything. There are limits, especially as it relates to transit, but those of you that were talking about, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, all of these highway dollars can basically be used for any of those projects. So please keep that in mind as you are engaging with your states. They can fund, yeah. Second, the Highway Safety Improvement Program included a really interesting clause, which is that if 15% or more of roadway fatalities are vulnerable road users, 15% of HSIP money must be used to mitigate and help the safety of those users. So vulnerable road users, we're talking about bicyclists, pedestrians, those using wheelchairs, things like that. All three of these states, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, are above that 15% mark. In fact, just one stat is Maryland is at 24% of their roadway fatalities are vulnerable road users. So until all of these places can get below that figure, they're going to have to spend at least 15% of their HSIP money on those issues. So the hitting one here, one of these formula programs, one of the ones that is new and good is the carbon reduction program and Protect. These are both focused on climate, carbon reduction mostly on lowering emissions, and you can imagine what kind of projects would lower emissions, bike, ped, transit. Protect program is based on, is focused on resiliency, especially think a lot of the floodplain communities in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, places that are vulnerable to flooding, and enabling people who don't use a car to be able to get out of those situations when there's a flood. On the MPO program, metropolitan planning focus, there's a much more significant focus now on housing, which with the region's housing crisis is welcome news, and connecting it to transit and land use.
So I was going to say real quick here from my experience working at the Hampton Roads MPO, once upon a time, like the housing planner would be in another part of the building, and I would rarely speak to them. I would personally and try to coordinate as best I can, but as a process, like we never coordinated with the housing planner. Whereas now this infrastructure, I was like, you should have a consistent conversation about this because these systems are all interconnected. So it's critically important.
Yeah, so if you have anyone in your MPO saying, yeah, do we really need to connect this transit to housing? Yes, you do. It's in the law, or at least you need to consider it. So another thing that Benito mentioned before was that this, among planning funds in the IIJA, this new infrastructure law, 2.5% of them now have to go to complete streets planning. Big win. So that, your states are going to have a lot more funding to plan for complete streets. And that means that all three of these states can update, hopefully, their rather old policies. Maryland's in 2011, DC's in 2010, and Virginia in 2004. And all of these states, especially Virginia in 2004, those of you who have been in the states since then, we're talking about a very different state than exists today. And so we need different.
And actually get an actual complete streets policy in Virginia, because it's more of like, consider bikes are on the road. That's it. It doesn't talk about complete streets principles.
Right. It's so updating, strengthening, making all of these complete streets policies, using this money to make all of these complete streets policies work for a modern DMV. So like we said, unless advocates put in a lot of work making sure that these massive formula programs go to the right things, we're going to see a lot of damage. And I will go over later what that might look like and what it kind of already is looking like. But there are these small competitive grants that could help to mitigate some of that. So they're not the bulk of the funds, but they're there. So reconnecting communities is one of them. Again, like Benito talking about, who are we building for, people or cars? This is trying to make it for people. The congestion relief program, the thing I'll highlight here is there's a big focus on congestion pricing. So those of you who are focused on that issue, this program is huge for that.
And likewise, also for those in the urban DC and like the cities particularly, has references to parking, which historically has not, considering my background in parking. To actually have federal funds to actually do demand-based parking pricing is critically important, because if you control where you store your vehicle, which spends 97% of its time parked, you can start to make a difference on people making transportation choices.
Mm-hmm. So the Protect grants, of course, we went over the formula side. This is the competitive side. There are two sides of this program. Most importantly, and I think this is really indicative of the difference between competitive and formula grants, for those of you who are not familiar with that, sort of the statutory difference, formula grants are always just going to go to the state or the MPO, your regional governments. Competitive grants can go to your localities. So if you're a small city, like those who said before, who just wants to go out and do this on their own, you can apply for a competitive grant without having to coordinate too much with the state. So you don't have to beg the state for money. One more thing, Benito, just real quick on that other slide. The corridor ID program, this is you may have heard that this infrastructure law put a big influx of cash into passenger rail. This corridor ID program is going to be the very start of that process. So Virginia especially has a great opportunity here to identify rail corridors connecting it to the south and to the west, because Maryland and DC are already connected along the Northeast corridor, but especially for Virginia here, rail nerds in Virginia, your ears should be perking up. All right.
So we're going to speed this up a little because I know we're running low on time.
So these are two sort of administrative actions that we've been watching in DOT, through the implementation of this law. Not going to go too much into them, but if you're interested, we can certainly follow up on them, or if you have any questions on the safe systems approach and the MUTCD.
So MUTCD real quick, that's the standards that engineers will throw at you. Is like, well, that's the standard. That's the standard. Well, that MUTCD is what they're referring to. And it's very car-centric, but Congress finally said, like, you all need to revisit this and count for vulnerable road users. So that's pivotal in the infrastructure law.
Mm-hmm. So here are some of the sort of the competitive side, or some more transit grants other than the ones that are just given out to areas basically with no strings. The Capital Investment Grant Program, this is the major competitive grant program for transit. So if you're looking to do a big transit thing in your area, CIG is the way to go. Definitely look into that. And here you can see some examples of what that might look like. The State of Good Repair Formula Grant Program, this for the first time is focusing a lot more on zero emission transit, as well as are some of these more competitive grant programs. DC's zero emission fleet plan is a good example of what this might look like. Also worth noting that those of you who are looking to fund transit operations, maintenance, salaries, CMAQ funds can go to some limited transit operations. This is another one of those big formula grant programs for highways.
Congestion mitigation, air quality, that's a formula program. Yep.
So let's take a second to go into what the DMV governments are doing currently. Are we gearing up for a Boon or a boondoggle? And obviously that question is complicated. So let's look at the stuff that we want as kind of smart growth people who are thinking about these long-term challenges. So on transit and rail, the Maryland governor, Larry Hogan, is not terribly supportive of transit, and in fact has been an opponent of expanding transit, but has, because of the actions of the Democratic legislature, has provided a great deal of support for transit, not as much in Virginia, and obviously DC is a good bit more supportive of transit given its reliance. Active transportation, Maryland, not a whole lot on the state level. This is more local, and DC has a significant amount of support for active transportation in their FY23 budgets.
Stephen, if I could, you mentioned something really important about Maryland. The governor traditionally, historically, has had a great deal of power in setting the table for the legislature to make decisions, but that is changing, right?
So yes, the laws haven't changed. Maryland still has a strong governor. The legislature has a very limited capacity to change the budgets that the governor sets. But the legislature did pass a law basically initiating some sort of parity between transit funding and highway funding that has, handcuffed the governor a bit in his efforts to expand highways. And we'll go over what those efforts are a little bit in the next couple slides.
And on the Virginia side, this is where it's a red flag right now with the current governor that just came in and the tidal wave that happened in the General Assembly. The only thing that's holding back from just being an auto-dominated state at this point is the Virginia Senate, which is precarious at best right now. So they need all the support that it can get, because right now most of the House of Delegates and the governor are more auto-minded. And actually, I was at a presentation a couple of weeks back. They were talking about transportation equity that the previous assembly had mandated the state do, and the current governor was like, "You're going to delete the word equity out of that report." So now I think it's DRPT, the Transit Rail and Transit Agency, is like, the legislature told us to do this. Now you're telling us to delete the word. Wait, what? So there's already some challenging times ahead in Virginia.
So here, to the extent, so with the question of whether the infrastructure law is a boon or a boondoggle for the DMV, these state budgets are really the only thing that can answer that question. And so far, looking like a little bit, we're getting some boondoggle notice. Look at, when we're looking
If I
at,
can jump in, Stephen, real quick, I just want to speed this up real quick, sorry. At a high level here, also these budgets were built in a time that still the infrastructure law dollars hadn't come completely down. Now that the dollars have actually hit the bank accounts, some things are starting to change. Like, for example, for Maryland, like we would put a dot now over at near where it says King George, right above there. They're talking about expanding that bridge. The William Harry Nice Bridge, I think is what it's called, down there on 301. So there's been new projects added since. So the context here, but overall the issue, Stephen, I think your point here is like, it's still a lot of roadway expansion, which, they'll say it's for relief, but really it's just more induced demand. On the DC side, they're focused on, as I mentioned before, complete streets, state of repair and safety. On Virginia side, this is how it breaks out, and they do their budget every 2 years, and this was the year that they did the big budget. But again, when we look at this was before, seeing the money in the bank account from the infrastructure law. There's still a lot that's focused on roadway expansion, and especially now with this current governor, that's going to be of concern. Turn back over to you, Stephen.
great. So that's what they're doing currently. So the question is, how do you jump in? Those of you who are advocates, even those of you who are local officials, or just citizens interested in this, how do you jump in? So we have developed, a plan for how to engage most effectively in these questions. So first is accountability questions. Transparency is huge, making sure that the decision-making process is well known, that there's public engagement. And emphasize that, road spending is a short-term, narrow-minded solution, and that transit, active transportation spending are more sustainable for a quickly growing and burgeoning region with a lot of issues. So we're going to show you on the next couple slides how to actually do this. So big thing is showing up early and often to support allies. We have a lot of allies in this region. The Montgomery County Planning Department has produced a really great long-term plan, Thrive Montgomery 2050, but they're getting a lot of heat for it. So it's just a matter of giving allies support and making sure that local officials know that those who are in favor of smart growth are numerous. And using evidence like induced demand, the fact that when you build wider roadways, you increase traffic can really help with that. Another thing is those of you who have mentioned greenhouse gas emissions, this is a great time for you to shine, making sure that your regional and state governments measure transportation emissions and factor those into performance measures is huge. Building equity and safety into those processes is great. So what does this ecosystem look like? This is a model that we've built out to sort of map the process for engaging your regional DOTs and your MPOs. The public comment phase is too late. By the time public comment has happened, most plans are set in stone. So make sure that you insert yourselves as early as you can in those internal departmental assessments, and those long-term plans, those priority setting stages is really the time to engage.
And the example here is from my time at DDOT, between now and August is the time to talk to them for fiscal year 24. I know we're still in 2022, but that's the time, if you want to talk about priorities, is between now and August, because they'll be laying out their priorities to the mayor's office in the fall and the winter. And then right now, the fiscal year 23 budget, if it's not approved this week, will be approved next week. And then that's done. That's a done deal. So, I mean, still, well, yeah, the comment period is pretty much over. So if you want to influence the budget process, build yourself a 14-month lead time from the budget that's going to be enacted. 14 months back, you need to be talking to the state DOT or the MPO, et cetera.
Wanted to take one slide to highlight MPOs. If you might see yours here, there are I believe 7 in Maryland, 14 in Virginia, and only 1 in DC, Metropolitan Washington Cog. But we wanted to highlight a couple really good inflection points for advocating with MPOs. First of all, where you see those high impact public comments, you can deliver them on those comprehensive plans, those long-term plans that the MPOs will develop. And as well as when they're developing scoring measures and project design, these early stage sort of planning stages that you can engage with MPOs and really have a high level of impact on. And also you can look at examples like Boston's MPO for better definitions of safety, which actually include vulnerable road users.
And I'll say previously from an MPO, you know, they want to be involved with the community. It's just people don't know who they are. So every chance you get to, you know, tell, you know, those advocates that you work with, let them know about the MPO. They want to be helpful here. They're the regional convener on, you know, coordination on transportation and housing issues. So definitely engage them early and often. And with that, as we wrap up here, you know, Transportation for America, you know, we have several resources that we've produced to kind of distill the infrastructure law. You know, we have a blog series, we've highlighted some administrative actions, we've done funding briefs. So say you're interested in complete streets projects, like, well, what funding streams can I use? So we have these funding briefs that go into those. We're also continuing to hold USDOT and states accountable. And we're also, you know, as we think about the implementation of the infrastructure law, is like, what's the good, bad, and the ugly from this that need to be influenced in the next reauthorization? And we have our hub here, t4a.org/IIJA. As I mentioned, slides will be shared. And this is how you can connect with us. And with that, that is all our slides. And I know we ate into some of the questions, but I'll turn it over to you, Ron.
And thank you both for that more expansive presentation than the one that was given to our DC 10 members, but I'm learning more, and I think our hopefully all of our attendees have learned a lot. So let's get to some of the questions that are in the chat and the Q&A. First, how much correlation with land use planning is required, if at all, from the federal level, and or how much coordination with land use planning do DMV area governments do in practice?
So there isn't any requirement to coordinate land use and transportation, unfortunately. It's the infrastructure law just that went through in November strongly encourages it now. Transportation, land use, and housing. They're strongly encouraging MPOs, and we should hopefully see some more guidance from USDOT as to what that means.
And if I could, you use this phrase, strongly encourage, strongly advise. Can you talk briefly like about the tools that USDOT uses to strongly encourage state and local DOTs to do what it wants it to do what the federal DOT wants them to do?
Well, they issue guidances for things like that. When it's mandated, then they'll issue a rule. Unfortunately, as we saw in December, there was a guidance memo, the December 16th memo, what they call it, the infamous memo. I think it was an amazing memo. Talk about prioritizing, you know, maintenance and safety over highway expansion, and state DOTs lost their mind. They were like, you're dictating what we should and should not do. And, you know, the secretary reiterated in March, like, this is just common sense principles, and we're just sharing our thoughts, and we encourage people to follow suit, but they're under no obligation to do so. And the way Congress wrote the law when it came to that coordination, they also basically say strong encourage, because there are some states that just don't want to play ball. And the senators, they wrote the law in a way so that it would be palatable for them. But there are regions that are doing some coordination on land use. You know, I'll highlight, you know, North Carolina. I think it's the Durham area that did something like that in the early 2000s. And then, you know, my time at Hampton Roads, I was tasked to create a regional land use map so that we can use it in the transportation planning process to look at existing land use condition and future. And then that's where you found, I point to like Newport News, Virginia, and York County, Virginia, where they realized we have industrial over here and residential right next to each other. And then we're trying to do transportation, like, well, there's a mismatch here. We need to fix this. So it was eye-opening for them, and it started to transform some of their practices there.
There's a follow-up to the question about the guidance memo. I'd like to get to another one. Where can folks find the infamous December 16th guidance memo?
We will share that after this, but it's USDOT does have an IIJA implementation hub as well, but we will share with you all and circulate it.
And for little peers that's been in the chat, I know we're running out of time. I think this is an important question. In metro areas, how much will MPOs have a say in use of carbon reduction program funds versus the states?
The MPOs will have a say in this, but also at the same time, this is a balancing act with the states. At the end of the day, the state is the recipient. But there is some framework in the infrastructure law that talks about the MPOs do have a say in this. Just like I'll pivot over to surface transportation block grant. There is transportation alternatives, which historically was 1% to 2% of those dollars. Now it's 10%. Of that 10%, the law actually wrote out 60% of this is at local and regional discretion. So, so for transportation alternatives, the localities and the MPOs will have more of a say than historically they've been. And there's similar language to that effect on the carbon reduction side. But at the end of the day, the state is still the final recipient. So it will be close coordination with the state. But the MPOs and localities have a little more say than historically have been, at least the language that's running through the infrastructure law.
Stephen, can I get one to you? To that point on why doesn't Maryland have as much toward active transportation if it's a local decision?
So first of all, just I'll clarify that any urbanized area over 50,000 states have to allocate 65% of their carbon reduction money to the MPO. So the MPO will have but that is just in those larger urbanized areas. And why does a state like Maryland not fund active transportation as much on the state level? It's a good question. This has generally been considered more of automatic light. Generally been considered more of a local issue, but this is something we'd like to see more funded on the state level. These more substantial bike commute projects we saw coming from Utah. A state not generally great with a lot of bike ped issues, but they do have these substantial regional trails that allow people to really commute long distances by bike. So that is something that can be a state level between municipalities, but largely on the local level right now.
And on the Maryland side, I want to chime in just from personal experience there, an opportunity if you use the spine idea from the Active Transportation Investment Program is there's an opportunity for DC and Baltimore to be connected by a bike trail. There's a gap just north of Bowie, though, that requires a bridge, a connection. So there is a trail that goes all the way up to this river, and then there's a trail on the other side that goes all the way into downtown Baltimore. With this, there's that one little gap. And of course, improving some of the connections, especially like in New Carrollton area. There's an opportunity to create, because right now on the Virginia side, you can go all the way from Purcellville all the way to Mount Vernon and easily connect into DC and connect to various communities within Fairfax and Loudoun County. But there's still that kind of infrastructure missing on the Maryland side to create a truly regional, interconnected spine and spoke bike network.
Well, I want to thank Benito Pérez, who's Policy Director at Transportation for America, and Stephen C. Kenny, who is Policy Associate at Transportation America, for this really, really informative presentation. Again, you will have slides of this presentation emailed to you, along with the recording of the webinar. We will try to get some questions that we didn't get answered over to Benito and Stephen, and maybe a follow-up post or follow-up emails to folks who have those questions. Again, I want to thank you. My name is Ron Thompson Jr. On behalf of Greater Washington and my colleague Kate Jatoff-Her, we would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Folks.